Welcome to Because the Beatles, the podcast about the Beatles, everything about the Beatles, 24/8. I'm Erica.
And I'm Allison. And before we start, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts or stream us on Spotify or YouTube. And if you're enjoying BC the Beatles, feel free to leave us a preferably 5-star review so other Beatlemaniacs can find us.
Also, don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter/X, and TikTok. We'll be posting videos, photos, and more from this episode and beyond. And you can also email us at bcthebeatles@gmail.com. And we are back in 1966 in the month of March, one of my favorite months in 1966, if I do say so.
Yes, I think you'll know rather quickly why Erica was so excited for this one to come up.
Best month of the year.
Well, I'm excited. I think, we left off on some really interesting times in the Beatles world with them conducting the interviews with Maureen Cleave, and we'll see some of that come up as well.
Might be my favorite month of the year, but just as a reminder, Tony Barrow later said about this, the year's downhill trend began on March 25th.
I wonder why.
You can be the judge.
Yes, exactly. Well, the Beatles, as we were talking about, they sort of start coming out of hibernation in March. And as they emerge, the divide between who they were and who they were becoming had never been so stark. And on March 25th, like Erica said, you really see the divide become even clearer. So the month begins with the band's feet firmly planted in early Beatlemania, so on one side of the divide, with the premiere of the Beatles at Shea Stadium concert film on March 1st. So the recording had been plagued by sound issues, which they tried to fix in post. This was pretty common back then. A somewhat usable film was cobbled together through overdubs and replacing some songs entirely with footage from the Hollywood Bowl concerts, which had also been recorded. And they cut 2 songs altogether, and those songs were She's a Woman and Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby. So in the UK, it was shown in black and white on BBC One, and it was greeted mainly with a shrug, not a big deal. Melody Maker wrote that, quote, "It's not the best program of Beatle music because of the very limitations of the open-air stadium and the wall of sound surging from the crowd." And they went on to say that even, quote, "as a sociological study of pop fan hysteria, it missed the mark because it barely showed the crowd." And they ended their review saying, even though it's a, quote, "unique contribution to pop in general and the Beatle cult in particular, the UK fans were still at a disadvantage in comparison to their American counterparts since the US release was in full color and released in theaters, which, way better than just seeing it in black and white on your tellies of home."
They repeated this problem in Magical Mystery Tour a few years later.
Yes. Production budgets have been going up since A Hard Day's Night, obviously help us in color. Once the Beatles enter the color world, let's, keep them there.
It doesn't make sense to me why, if the film itself was in color.
Yeah.
What would be the reason for not showing it in color? Not everybody had a color TV, obviously, but those who did could have seen it in color. So I don't understand why that choice was made. I don't know if maybe Sid Bernstein or whoever partially owned the U.S. rights was restricting it or something, but it seems like a strange choice to me.
Yeah, that's the only thing that comes to mind for me is if there was some sort of exclusivity with Bernstein, but I don't know. That's a good question. I can't imagine it would have been budgetary because it wouldn't have cost more or less for the black and white versus the color, I wouldn't think. I don't know.
It sounds like if it was in black and white and it was on a small screen, all of the issues that the Beatles were trying to fix and that they kind of had with touring generally came to the forefront when you couldn't really see the spectacle for yourself.
So it doesn't really enhance the experience of seeing the concert. It doesn't really embody that properly in this black and white kind of low res, it sounds like, film.
Well, lucky for everybody, it's not the end of touring, obviously, because 2 days later, the trend toward going back to Beatlemania continues as Brian announces the locations for the upcoming 1966 summer tour, which he says at this time will include Japan, Germany, including a victory lap back in Hamburg for the first time, the US, and the UK. No dates are actually set at this point, and the UK dates end up going away and are replaced by the Philippines dates, which was a whole other can of worms, unfortunately.
That was a whole thing.
Yeah, it was a thing.
we did a episode on that. Go listen to it.
Yeah, and I'm sure we'll revisit it in the summer when we
definitely
talk about the very crazy July and August they had. Yeah. But Despite the unexpectedly quiet start to the year, the Shea Stadium concert, followed by this announcement, seems to be telling the public that Beatlemania is still going strong coming into 1966.
The week ended the first week of March with the publication of the first of Maureen Cleave's profiles in the Evening Standard, starting with John. And, compared to the US uproar, which, we'll get into, the UK reaction was pretty tame, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen at all. It definitely, there was some, notice of it. And so on March 7th, John Grigg wrote in The Guardian, quote, "Last Friday, the Evening Standard published an account by Maureen Cleave of some hours spent in the company of John Lennon, the Beatle. Mr. Lennon, who is said to be reading extensively about religion, was not very encouraging about the prospects for Christianity. Christianity will go, he said. We're more popular than Jesus now," which, I don't know, Erica, is that the first time we're seeing it called out in an external publication?
This, as far as I know, is the first time because it was only put out on, I think, the 4th or the 5th of March. So 3 days later, people are starting to read it. John Grigg was a columnist in The Guardian, technically a humor columnist. I don't know if this is a humorous column, but it's supposed to be humor. So this is the first response to it publicly, and there are a few other responses from the public that I found. But yeah, this guy read it, and certainly it hit a nerve because he wrote a column in response to it days later.
Right. He picked it right out of this article. And he goes on to say, this would be an interesting subject for a public opinion poll, more interesting than the state of parties or the relative popularity of the party leaders. Is it really true the Beatles now have a bigger following than Jesus? The younger age groups may prefer the Beatles, but might not Jesus have a better rating with the audience as a whole? Besides, this is kind of interesting.
Here's the humor part.
I know. I like this part made me chuckle. He says, besides, Jesus's manager might reasonably claim that to keep even a modest place in the charts over 2,000 years is a fair achievement. Mr. Lennon sees merit in the founder of Christianity, but blames his fans. Quote, "Jesus was all right, but his disciples were thick and ordinary. It's them twisting it that ruins it for me." That's what John said. The same fate has befallen other great men, Beatlemaniacs. Oh, this is not John talking, by the way. This is Greg. This same fate has befallen other great men. Beatlemaniacs are a distant obstacle to higher appreciation of the Beatles. In the Disciples' Day, people who were, quote, "thick and ordinary" could win fame and martyrdom by throwing up their careers and associating with a man of genius. Nowadays, they can win fame without martyrdom through a combination of bad taste and good publicity. I loved, you know me, I love the note about Jesus's manager.
Yeah, right. I love it that the audience is catching strays in this one, calling him thick and like he's really hitting everyone.
I know, right? It's so funny. And then, we had a little bit of a reaction from the Evening Standard itself, which is where Maureen's pieces were published. So an Evening Standard reader wrote into the editor on March 9th and said, "As a loyal reader of the Evening Standard for many, many years, I feel justified in expressing my opinion of Maureen Cleave's nauseating article entitled 'How Does a Beatle Live?'"
There we go. Nauseating.
Great, love it. Might I ask how Miss Cleave arrives at the conclusion that the Beatles are as famous as the Queen? I love that this is what's pissing her off. And that the Beatles and the Queen, quote, "tick over in the public esteem." Since when were the Beatles held in public esteem?
Oof.
Yeah. And as for John Lennon's reference to his father, which we talked about last episode, and John said, quote, "I showed him the door. I wasn't having him in the house." The reader says, "I am surprised that Miss Cleave's apparent adulation for Mr. Lennon blinded her to the fact that no gentleman would discuss his private family affairs for publication in a national newspaper." That's what you're pissed off about? Again. Okay. And then she wraps it up by saying, "The final straw is John Lennon's impotent assertion that, quote, we're more popular than Jesus now." All right, she gets to the heart of the matter. She says, "I have no doubt at all that his, quote, valuable opinion about Christianity will be treasured in the halls of literature for years to come."
Huh.
I'm sensing sarcasm. I don't know.
This person, I don't know their gender, but I hear this in the voice of that person on a hard day's night. I hear, the guy on the train? I take this train twice a week. That guy.
Yes.
I feel like it's that guy.
That's hilarious. In my mind, it was like a Karen, but I don't know. It could be wrong.
The person is awful, whatever they are.
Yeah.
And they seriously had a big problem. I don't get the feeling that this is like a Beatles fan who's taking umbrage with something John said. I think that the fact that John Lennon got column inches in the Evening Standard was enough to piss them off to begin with.
Yeah. Definitely, definitely like a proper paper.
Yeah. I mean, the Jesus comment really is just an afterthought to the
It literally comes at
Queen.
the end of this op-ed. Yeah.
She hated it.
Yeah. So the following day, another critique appeared in the Cornish Guardian, and it said, one is tempted to ask whether his or any other present day, quote, beat groups will be remembered, except by some social historians studying the 1960s. What? Hey. In 100 years' time, almost. Whereas members of the Christian churches number some hundreds of millions, nearly 2,000 years after Christ. The Beatles spokesman's opinion would not be worth noting, but for the fact that it may be symptomatic of some teenagers' notions today and may possibly influence their conduct. This is the best. Rowdyism among young people may be partly, but not wholly, due to high spirits.
Rowdyism, the plague of our society.
Let's keep them down. Rowdyism. That's the first time I've ever heard that word. That's hilarious.
That's great. That is great.
Rowdyism. Oh my goodness gracious. That's hilarious. But overall, though, the comments were pretty mild and insignificant in comparison to the American response later that year. We'll see how that is coming up.
The problem I have with all of these is that they don't get the point of what he was trying to say.
Yeah, absolutely.
They're not thinking that he wasn't trying to slag off religion. He was trying to just make a point about fame and idolatry, something that was really on his mind those days, and that maybe there was some truth into it. Maybe it wasn't just some rowdyism, blasphemy coming from a Beatle.
Yeah, and also it's his opinion. I mean, he's allowed to have an opinion. I know his opinion is more public than a lot of ours, but he's still allowed to have it.
He's not trying to be a role model.
Yeah, well, insofar as them also talking about corrupting the youth, like keep in mind, he's talking to the Evening Standard here. He's not talking to Tiger Beat, So it's like he's having a conversation with a friend, two adults having a conversation. It's not the what's your favorite color, what's your favorite food. No disparagement to Tiger Beat or anything, but it's like obviously two different conversations would be had. And the fact that Datebook, a teen mag, picks it up, I find super interesting. But again, that's coming later.
That's part of this divide that I think we're seeing. It's not just that they're growing their intellectual horizons, but they're adults.
Right.
And they have adult thoughts and they think about adult matters. Especially John. He's 25 at this point, which in that generation, that's a full adult.
Well, he's 25 and he has a kid and he's married and he's a homeowner and he's a rock star and like he's a full-ass grown adult, and he's been through trauma, a lot of trauma. So he's, he grew up super fast, John, even though he's immature in a lot of ways that we all know, we all have opinions on. But he talks to Maureen Cleave about reading books about religion. He's super interested in it. So, of course, it's on his mind. He's going to address it. And he should be able to do that again.
I still think that the things that George said were worse. And because it was George, nobody batted an eye because John said these things. If they were switched, whatever George had said would have been the thing that people were talking about because they thought it came out of John's mouth.
That would have been hilarious if George had become like the controversial Beatle.
Oh my God.
What a world. Or Paul, I don't know. That would have been hysterical. And not to get too in the weeds with this because we've got a big month ahead of us to talk about, but do you think and again, I'm getting too far ahead of ourselves because we could talk about this bigger than Jesus controversy forever. And maybe we should do a whole episode on it. But do you think it changed the trajectory of John's life overall? Because I feel like that was the first time he realized his voice could be used for, I don't want to say political activism, but to have these sorts of opinions and how the world sat up and took notice of them.
Yeah. I mean, I think not only this, but the fact that he had to grovel, I think really changed his opinion about whether he would be willing to put up with that behavior in the future, too.
Yeah, definitely.
But instead of shutting up, he started being more outspoken.
Yeah, he kind of doubled down. He would do that for the rest of his life.
This year has started that pathway for him. And I think that the way that Brian and the Beatles machine had to deal with it versus the way he wanted to deal with it was probably another reason that John later in this year made basically a total break from the Beatles persona.
Definitely. It's a catalytic year, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But yeah, so getting back into, again, we could talk about this forever. So getting back into March here. So over in the US on March 15th, so we're in the middle of the month now, the Beatles were nominated for 10 Grammys, but guess what? They didn't win any. And I know. So this prompted Capitol President Alan Livingston to publicly protest the fact that Yesterday didn't win Song of the Year. And he said it makes a mockery of the whole event. And the following year, they won 3 awards. So there you go.
And it did seem to be a fight between old and new in that case as well, in that Frank Sinatra and Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Brass were the big winners that year. There was kind of an uproar that people felt that the voting for the Grammys was way too conservative and not taking the current pop landscape into account at all.
Yeah.
So it did sort of change after that.
That's so interesting because it's 1966. It's not like it's 1964. It's like the Beatles had already kind of been kicking around for a few years.
I guess if you're talking about the 66 Grammys, we're really talking about 65.
Oh, true. Yeah.
The world is always a couple of months behind anyway. I don't know. Maybe it just took them a little time to catch up. Plus, Yesterday, it's a weird pop song, and it's the first really weird pop song. Maybe people didn't know what to do with it. I don't know.
Well, at least they, kind of made up for it the following year.
They sure did.
And in film news in the UK, the Beatles, Brian, Cilla, and their wives, girlfriends, etc., attended the premiere of the movie Alfie, which, of course, Cilla did the title track to. That was on March 24th. And beautiful Cilla, obviously, was the superstar that night.
Yes, and Gene Asher also had a small part in that film. Eleanor Braun did as well, who was their co-star in Help. So they had a lot of friends over there.
Oh, I love that.
And they look amazing. You should look at the pictures from that premiere night.
Those premiere photos are fantastic. We'll post some on our socials. But yeah, so overall, kind of quiet month so far. Once April hits, they'll be diving deep into recording Revolver. But first, I guess it's time to talk about March 25th.
March 25th, the wild, wild events of March 25th that draw a clear line between who the Beatles were and where they are going. So March 25th was a Friday. It was cold, miserable Friday in London, and it was their first real publicity day of the entire year. So we're almost at the end of the third month of the year. Other than things like the Maureen Cleave interviews, they really hadn't been out there. They had nothing to promote, and they were doing this quiet exploration, exploring their own interests and paths, really for the first time since they became Beatles. And all people were getting were those Maureen Cleave profiles coming out once a week. And in fact, Paul's profile literally came out that morning of the 25th. Despite all of this exploration and intellectual expansion, everything they were about to experience for the first part of that afternoon was the complete opposite. They were walking into a full-on Beatlemania press circus, press-full interviews, tons of reporters from a variety of papers, all coming with their own reporters, cameras, flashbulbs. On top of that, they had 2 photographers taking internal pictures. They had Robert Whittaker, and they also had Nigel Dixon from the Beatles Book Monthly. So it was chaos. And it was the kind of thing they used to love in their early days, the sort of chaos where some of their wittiest lines come from. Real life situations that were so interesting that the famous press conference scene in A Hard Day's Night was written based on the lines that they actually said in real life at events like this. But now they were just kind of over it. In the space of these months, they've changed a lot, but it seems that nobody else has either changed or they haven't noticed. So they're still getting the same questions, the same jokes about haircuts and fans. And, meanwhile, they're about to go make Revolver. Like next week, they're going to start laying down the tape loops for Tomorrow Never Knows. They are in a completely different wavelength. This tension that's been building throughout 1966 is essentially baked into the day. They're being asked to go back in time and perform themselves as the Beatles circa 1964, but they're nowhere near that. But they didn't have a lot of time to think about this because the whole day was so tightly orchestrated. With Brian's approval, Tony Barrow had started planning this a few weeks before, and he stacks it with all of these interviews because he has no more press photos to give out. People are asking for quotes, people are asking for materials, people are asking to talk to the Beatles, and nothing's happened. So he's trying to get it all together in one day. And it's much harder to do that now because they don't live in the same city anymore. Between getting married, three of them moved out to Weybridge. They have these large mansions. And Paul had just bought his home in London. He was renovating it. They're just going in four different directions. And once they didn't have that structure of a tour or a recording or a film, this stuff kind of faded into the background for them. Even the act of assembling them is a logistical accomplishment at this point. And Tony Barrow's maximizing every second once he's gotten them there. For someone like Tony Barrow, the Cleave interviews and a few other interviews that they had done throughout March, which were more long form, more of the style of Maureen Cleave's, they weren't really usable to him. There's not great sound bites of the type that like a teen magazine would like, except maybe, We're More Popular Than Jesus seemed to become a sound bite, but I don't think anybody wanted that one.
No, that's like the worst nightmare, the worst case scenario. Yeah.
He needed more material. This is the first time I think that anybody in the Beatles press machine had looked around and been like, God, we're out of material. What the hell? So they needed to fill up. Tony had requested not only to have an interview day, but to have Robert Whittaker, come in and take more press photos. Robert Whittaker was, at this time, the NEMS Enterprises house photographer. And Tony Barrow didn't really love this. This had been going on for about a year and a half by this point. And Barrow preferred their original method, which was choosing photographers to photograph specific moments or a limited amount of time, like Robert Freeman shooting iconic album covers or Harry Benson, who photographed them on tour. They were hired for an assignment and were expected to photograph the Beatles at their camera-ready, pressed professional best. Whittaker was tasked with neither of these and had very little interest in doing either of those. Whittaker was an odd choice for a staff photographer. He was a British-born photographer who had been building a name for himself in both the editorial and art photography worlds in Melbourne, Australia. And Brian had met him on the 1964 Australian tour when Whittaker had come with a writer friend to take photos for a newspaper profile of Brian. Bob Whittaker had been struck by what he called a peacock quality in Brian, a sense that he had this emperor-like demeanor. And he had this technique of adding props or photographic overlays to his photos to communicate some larger message. So instead of just creating normal press photos, Bob superimposed a crown of peacock feathers encircling Brian's head. And that's how he developed these photos.
I love that photo, by the way.
It's a great photo. A kind of a risky move. I mean, you have a once-in-a-lifetime chance to photograph the Beatles manager and do something totally unconventional like this. But his instincts were accurate. Brian loved these photos. He told Whittaker that no one had ever captured him like that before. And I think it's really interesting that he had done that because Brian was like a new breed of impresario, like those men, they have a reputation of being a bit sleazy, at least at this day and age. And Brian was none of that. He was refined and he was posh and his power derived from another place. And Bob Whittaker saw that. So after seeing more of Bob's work while in Melbourne, Brian offered him a newly created role of the NEMS artistic advisor. And he asked him to move back to the UK to work with his stable of artists, where Brian would personally manage his career too. This is a crazy thing. It's a big risk for Whittaker, who'd really been building up his own reputation in Australia, but he was British born. And so After a couple of months of hemming and hawing about this, he accepts Brian's offer and moves back to his home country. And he quickly becomes embedded with the Beatles, capturing all kinds of moments in their lives, from giant events like the Shea Stadium shows to the most intimate moments like the birth of Ringo's son, Zach. And it was just a totally different purpose. Rather than being hired for a one-off assignment, he's this consistent artistic presence. And not only that, sometimes he takes fly on the wall photographs, but a lot of times he doesn't. He inserts his own artistic commentary in the way he uses angle or the way he inserts props into a photo shoot. In the 2 years that he worked with the Beatles, he probably took way more pictures of the band than any other photographer. Yet I would say he's probably the least well known outside of the Butcher cover. That's probably because of the nature of his assignment. Like, he never really had a marquee moment like shooting the cover of Rubber Soul or with the Beatles. He's chronicling their lives in a more everyday sort of way. But also Whitaker as an artist is different from many other photographers. He's very interested in surrealism, and his idols are people like Salvador Dali and Man Ray. Like, he's not a press photographer. He did shoot like fashion photography for Vogue, but even so, he always had this idea that photograph should be about more than just smiling pretty for the camera. He had no interest in doing that. And even when he did studio work, the band is often posed with a variety of odd props. So if you ever see an album cover like the US cover for Beatles 65, where they're holding umbrellas and all kinds of things, and there's a moment where he brought in a dog. There's all kinds of things that he did. So if you ever see those are probably Whitaker photos, but there's a good chance that you don't know who took those. So another example of a Whitaker photo is the very, very famous photo of John, the portrait of John with the sunflower in his eye. That is probably one of the most famous Whitaker photos that a lot of people don't know is Whitaker. And it's even less likely that they think about how it came about, not a traditional photo shoot, but that Whitaker was thinking about the myth of Narcissus and the idea as the Beatles as modern day pioneers. And he went to John's home in Weybridge and did this photo shoot with John, Cynthia, and Julian, inserting his own artistic point of view into what he wants to say with the photos.
Didn't he also take a photo of John like staring into a mirror like Narcissus at that shoot?
Yeah, it's the same day. He's staring actually into the pond at his house.
Oh, okay.
And
okay.
he's like perched on the edge of the pond staring in. And then you see Cynthia is kind of over him, just watching him from afar. It's an interesting picture. There's another one where Cynthia is sitting down on a set of like outdoor stairs, and she's wearing this hat. I mean, it almost looks like a midsummer like flower crown, but
it's like hay or something, right?
Yeah, but it's like dead weeds.
Yeah, I was gonna say like it's crispy like flowers or something.
Yeah, it's not nice flowers. And then John is standing over her with a watering can.
Oh, yes.
Partially covered in black fur. There's some weird stuff, and they're really interesting. It's a great photo shoot. Probably the most connected to the lineage of the Butcher cover in a lot of ways, though people usually look at these photos a little bit more favorably as far as the subject matter.
Yeah, exactly.
So back to the 25th. They all meet at a photo studio in Chelsea at number 1, The Vale, in the very, very rich section of London known as Millionaires Row. This is not Whitaker's usual photo location. He actually borrowed it from another studio photographer that he knew because it was a lot bigger, and he knew that there would need to be a lot of space for all of the things that were happening this day. They arranged to be there at 2:00. Their chauffeur, Alf Bicknell, comes and collects John, George, and Ringo from Weybridge. And Neil Aspinall goes to collect Paul from London. And when they get there, it is already absolute chaos. Neil Aspinall described this part of the day, and it sounds just pandemonium. Some of the people that were there was a Brazilian journalist talking to John and Ringo. There was an Indian journalist asking George about the sitar. There was a Canadian reporter waiting to do taped interviews. There was Tom Lodge from Radio Caroline setting up his own gear. There were photographers everywhere. There was just so much noise, equipment, people rotating in and out. It was like nonstop for about an hour and a half. The Beatles were moving from station to station like it was an assembly line. So it was crazy. After that, there's another part before they get to the photos. It's this interview with Radio Caroline. And have we talked about Radio Caroline?
I don't know that we have, but, there was a very famous movie that came out, Pirate Radio, about Radio Caroline. It's a legendary station, like a pirate radio station that really broke a lot of different artists and records, back in this era. Broadcast, I think, on a ship, right? Off the coast of the UK.
Yeah. So what happened was there were these, what they called needle time laws. The BBC was restricted in the amount of recorded music that they could play on the radio. I think it was in an attempt to save live musicians' jobs in the wake of so much more recorded music. So they could only play something like 4 hours of recorded music a day. And they hardly ever even wanted to play pop. So you didn't get pop music very often. There were other options for people who wanted to listen to pop, like Radio Luxembourg, which obviously looms large of the Beatles legend that, they would set up weird antenna configurations because it was on the continent. It was very hard to get it, but they played a much larger amount of pop music, including American pop music. But it still wasn't really enough. However, because of these laws about radio play, they couldn't do what they wanted to. So what they did was they got a big old ship and they anchored it right out of the reach of Her Majesty's iron-fisted rule. And so they were able to broadcast this all-day radio with the style of high-energy American DJ patter that was not done in any of the other radio stations they were used to. So it was this rebellious, exciting new frontier in radio. And the Beatles were super proponents of pirate radio. They loved it. So that's where we are in the second portion of this day. We are with Tom Lodge, who's one of the DJs. He came to do this longer interview with the Beatles. The interview was meant to be the crown jewel interview in this flexi disc that they were calling Sounds of the Stars. It was a variety of spoken word interviews with Cilla Black and Cliff Richard and Dusty Springfield and all of the big pop music of the day, but it was all spoken word. And this was a favor to Brian, really, because it was meant to commemorate the merger of two music papers, Disc and Music Echo, into a new paper called Disc and Music Echo. And Disc was a long-standing weekly paper, and Music Echo had once been Merseybeat, and Brian had bought that at some point, or at least he had a large ownership stake in it. And when these two things merged, Brian had a 50% ownership stake in the new Disc and Music Echo. So the interviewer from Radio Caroline came to interview the Beatles, and it was supposed to be a win-win situation for everybody. Great for Brian, great for the Beatles. They love Radio Caroline. And then you listen to the interview. And oh my God. And they could not be bothered. I'm going to play a little bit right now, just how weird this was.
And how about you, Paul?
How about it?
Tell me a bit about your music writing.
Yes. Well, I'm writing.
Right. Thank you very much. Okay, Mr. Ringo.
Yes.
Yes. What's it like being a Beatle?
Oh, it's okay, you know.
It's okay.
Yeah.
Yes. And
yeah, it's okay.
Tell me a bit about what it's like being a married man and a Beatle.
It's okay. It's okay.
So they don't care. The questions are bad, which doesn't help. And to be fair to Tom Lodge, he didn't even know who he was interviewing until he got there. They did it all top secret. So he didn't have time to prepare.
He didn't know that he was interviewing the Beatles?
No, he didn't know who he was.
Oh my God.
I'm sure he knew that at one point he was going to be doing it, but he didn't know that day where he was going.
Okay.
So the questions are really unfocused. It's painful. There's awkward silences, there's nervous laughter. Every so often, they start like sniggering like schoolboys about drugs and sex. So painful. And so the full tape, the full interview is 21 minutes. Tom Lodge ended up editing it down to 90 seconds of usable material. And even that footage that they put on Sounds of the Stars is inane. They're totally disengaged. And it's super striking because just weeks earlier in the Cleave pieces, like if somebody were to pick up the paper that morning in the Evening Standard, or I guess in the evening, right? If they were to pick up that paper and see the Paul McCartney interview and then listen to this, it would be night and day. It's not even the same person. So that is where the Beatles kind of are. They're exhausted. They're over it. They're just over it. And while this is happening, in the corner of the studio, Bob Whittaker is just quietly setting up something totally insane. And while all this press chaos is happening, deliveries start arriving, including butcher coats, long nails, like hammer and nails, false teeth, glass eyes, bird cages, boxes of dismembered baby dolls, and then actual raw meat, like the gross bone-in raw meat, and a pig's head. It's all just coming in. It's all just sitting there.
So the baby doll showed up dismembered.
Yes, they showed up in pieces. Whittaker was very adamant about the fact that he did not take them apart. They came like that. So,
Wow. Okay. Interesting. I did not know that. I figured there was some disassemblage at some point. I didn't know that they showed up already disassembled.
Apparently that is how they came. That is how they came. So,
Amazing.
which makes it even weirder if let's say you're Tony Barrow and you're just watching this stuff happen and you contracted Whittaker for some nice publicity photos to put out on like the cards and the tour promotion and everything. And you're watching all this stuff come in, the dolls, the bone-in meat, the pig's head. Tony Barrow's not thrilled. John, however, is fucking delighted. He literally abandons his interview mid-sentence and goes over to the doll part, starts playing with them, and he is, quote unquote, cackling with glee, as Tony not so happily recalled. And this is really the first time all day that anything was capturing John's attention. So he was really happy.
That tracks. That's classic John right there.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So they get through everything else. And once the press finally clears out, that's when the real fun starts. At first, it's pretty normal. It's totally normal. They do the standard press shots. Everybody's seen these. They are wearing variations of turtlenecks and brown and ecru-colored outfits. John has like a camel-colored sport jacket on. They're not totally coordinated, but they're coordinated enough that they look like they meant to dress like that. Moving out of the four-headed monster look with the same suit, but they're still the Beatles. But it's pretty wild that those shots are very sedate. They're not super energetic. You can see the Beatles are a little bit more mature in these photos. But it's pretty funny that the most normal, widely used images of the Beatles in 1966 are taken literally minutes before the most controversial ones. There is a picture that Nigel Dixon from the Beatles Book Monthly took where he is photographing Whittaker taking these press photos. And in the corner of the picture, everything looks normal except there's this big metal bucket full of raw meat.
Shit.
It's great. It's one of my favorite pictures of all time.
That's hilarious. I love it.
So they got these press photos out of the way, and then they shift gears. And it gets interesting. It's not just weirdness for the sake of being bizarre, being incendiary. This is a whole conceptual framework that he's got. Whittaker calls the project a somnambulant adventure, which literally means an adventure while sleepwalking. The ideas of dreaming and sleepwalking that is just totally rooted in surrealism, like Dali, Magritte, but also he took some inspiration from Hans Bellmer, who's another surrealist and a little bit more of a controversial one. His whole thing is this set of unsettling, movable, jointed doll sculptures in this book that he called Die Puppe, the doll, and it's really disturbing. So Whitaker takes this idea and he is trying to comment on the idea that people are treating the Beatles like deities. He thinks it's absurd, and he wants to not only comment on it, but break the illusion. And Whitaker has the personal experience to back this up. He was embedded with the Beatles for the entirety of 1965. He saw everything. He saw the screaming, the desperation of parents bringing disabled and sick children to be like faith healed by a Beatle, and how horrified the Beatles were by that. And he's also gotten to see the real people under these Fab Four personas that somebody like Robert Freeman would never see because he wasn't around them long enough. As a photographer who was always looking to say more with his photos, he found that he had something to say. And he also got to know the band well. He was especially close to John. You know, they were always game to do whatever weird thing Bob proposed in the studio. And he knew that they were connoisseurs of the absurd, just like he was, and they liked pushing boundaries. He also knew that they were bored as hell with fame and dissolution with Beatlemania.
And I'm sure that the day sort of primed them to get even crazier because they'd had such a taxing, rote day with this press junket that they could not even be fucked to, even mentally show up for.
Right. A press junket for a tour that they wanted to go on as badly as you wanted to go to the dentist. Like, they were not excited about any of this stuff. And on the other side, you think about like the divide. In a week, they're recording a Revolver. Like, they know, they have a secret. They know that this isn't their real life anymore. They know it's coming. So yeah, they are probably, especially John, is just recoiling at this Beatlemania stuff that they're forcing them into again.
Yeah.
But, it is an odd photo shoot, and he starts off casually. You kind of have some transitional images. You see Paul holding a question mark poster. No big deal. You see a photo of Ringo with his hands together. It kind of looks like he's wearing invisible handcuffs. You see Paul and George inside of a bird cage. There's a photo of John holding a box over Ringo's head. The box is labeled 2 million. These are all symbols of Ringo's just one of 2 million people walking this earth, no more or less important than anybody else. The bird cage is obvious symbolism of being
trapped.
The singing bird trapped in a cage, yeah. And then they get a little weirder. With George hammering these like 9-10-inch nails into John's head. So we've got some more on the nose religious imagery coming up. And so you can kind of see how each photo is building toward this central thesis. And then it escalates more. The next thing is the weirdest photo maybe of the day. It's this bizarre tableau with the Beatles holding sausages, with this woman kneeling down in front of them with her hands up. It's supposed to be symbolizing how the Beatles are being born, just like any other human being. I don't know if this one totally made it. Like, this concept didn't totally translate. Even John's face kind of looks like, what the hell? So, but they do it, and it is part of Robert Whitaker's larger plan for this project. But then we get to the butcher images. And first they break out the dolls, just the dolls. And John and Paul especially are into it. They're reconstructing them. They're joking around. There's a picture of John like looking like he's making it talk like a ventriloquist dummy. George and Ringo are there. They don't look quite as enthused, but they're there. And then they put on the white coats. And then finally, the meat comes out. Now we've got the series of photos. We've got raw meat draped over them. We've got doll heads and limbs everywhere. They're getting coated with the blood of the raw meat. We've got some false teeth, and we've got some glass eyes. It's pretty crazy. And then they're smiling. And that's the thing that makes it so unsettling. They're smiling like a normal publicity shoot. So that's kind of what the unsettling moment is. You're seeing Beatles that you've always expected to see, just in this strange landscape. And, they're quite enjoying it. They're cheerful. They have this open expression. I think Paul especially. It's grotesque, but as far as I'm concerned, you can't look away. Like, it's very interesting.
Yeah, it's a bit like a car crash, in every sort of sense of the word. The gore and the shock of it. And the fact that they're smiling, it's completely like, it makes your skin crawl, not to mention the dolls.
It makes you ask why. Like, it's a total what the fuck moment, because why are they doing this? And especially because you think about Robert Whittaker, like who he is and what his objectives are and his artistic sensibility totally in the background. Nobody knows that this is like they're working with like a surrealist artist on staff. No one knows that stuff. So it looks like it's just like them coming up with this really bizarre idea. The thing about the Butcher images, it was never supposed to be an album cover. Not even Whittaker thought that it was supposed to be an album cover. He envisioned it as a modern art piece. He wanted to be a triptych, a 3-panel religious style art piece. And on the left would be that birth image with the sausage and the woman. In the center would be the Butcher image, though the background would be painted gold, and the band would have bejeweled halos like icons in a Russian Orthodox religious painting. And then on the right side of the triptych would be the hammer and nail image with some alterations. John's head would be superimposed with a wood block, and there would be the sea where the sky is meant to be and the sky where the sea is meant to be. So those were a few things that were supposed to happen. And the point was explicitly to open a conversation about idol worship with the Beatles as the most absurd type of saints or false idols. It was never meant to be an album cover.
Wow.
So the Beatles are on board. They're up to play. Paul's kind of like, okay, it's weird, but it's more interesting than usual. John's really into it. He loves the idea of breaking the illusion. And of course, as we move on to when the Butcher cover actually happens, John is the catalyst. John is the only catalyst. George hates it, calls it stupid. George has always got a fun perspective on things.
That tracks.
Yeah. He thought it was gross and he thought it was stupid. And Ringo was just like, I have no fucking idea why we did that. Which, I mean, fair. Like, I don't think that they were informed in advance exactly what was going to happen. They probably knew that something was planned, but they didn't know. So they just walked in and they were putting on the Butcher coats, and then the dolls came out, and then the meat. Fun side note that Whittaker later said that after the shoot was over, he returned that meat to the butcher, and it was sold for someone's Sunday roast later that day.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
Oh my God, that is disgusting. Somebody ate that. Besides the fact that people are like touching it and putting it everywhere, on smearing it on dolls, like it's also been sitting out for God knows how long. Like, Jesus Christ, how many people got food poisoning from that meat?
Who knows what happened? I hope they cooked it well.
Oh my God, I hope.
I'm sure that unsuspecting family had no idea what their Sunday roast had been getting up to the previous Friday.
Oh my gosh, that is unreal. Jesus.
So yeah,
Ugh.
Looking at the day, it's chaos and it's unusually weird. But kind of zoom out of it, it's really important. You see these two sides. You see on one side Brian's world, you have the press, the polish, the controlled image that got them in the door, that made them the Beatles, that they never would have gotten without that. And then on the other side, you have the Beatles with Robert Whittaker, a photographer who came here because Brian specifically wanted him, ironically. But they're pushing toward this weird, more confrontational, more honest portrayal of what they see on day-to-day lives as the Beatles. And obviously, these two things are really starting to clash, as they do in that room. As Tony Barrow had said, the year's downhill trend began on March 25th. And Tony also later said that the fact that the shoot happened at all shows that Brian's control had been starting to slip, that he said like a year before, this would have just been a non-starter. We're seeing this divide. We're seeing where the Beatles want to go. It's telling that for whatever reason, Brian wasn't there that day. So he didn't.
Yeah. Weird.
Tony told him all about it later. So I'm not sure where he was, but who knows what would have happened if Brian had walked in and seen that.
Oh my God. I can only imagine. Just absolute, like, all the color drained from his face. Like, I can just see it in my head.
Which is, I'm sure, exactly what happened when he first saw the photo shoot proof.
I can't even imagine. Yeah.
Yet, and we'll get to this, it was Brian who pushed that photo on Capitol.
Which is, it doesn't make any sense from somebody who was so poised, so refined, who changed his entire image to posh himself up, to make himself seem like he was above so much. And yet he advocated for this crazy, crazy thing.
Well, I think he was feeling very insecure about his place, I think, in the Beatles world, that the things that he did were no longer things that maybe they needed anymore, especially that they were hearing rumbles about not wanting to tour anymore, not enjoying it. And Brian's contract was set to expire the next year.
Right.
I think it was a combination of that. And like he said in his own Maureen Cleave profile, just undying loyalty and pride in the band, that even if he himself disagreed with this thing, he would advocate for them because they wanted it. And maybe this was a point where it would have been good to pull that back a little bit. Capitol accepted the photo because in a way they were also nervous about their position. Their contract was going to be coming up the following year too. So they didn't want to upset the Beatles. Nobody felt comfortable saying no.
Yeah, it was a perfect storm.
Mm-hmm. So that's March 1966, a very, very interesting month and day. And this is the explosion point, I think. This is the first major shift we see.
Yes, definitely. And, you know, as you said a couple of times, Erica, it's like the next week they go and start Revolver, and they would never be the same after that. Their sort of ascension into avant-garde music and changing their style forever. So crazy. Like what a tornado already 1966 has been, even though it started off kind of soft and cushy and chill, but not going to stay that way for long.
It's crazy how far they came in such a short amount of time.
Yes, exactly.
So that's where we are. Next time we talk about 1966, we'll be getting back into the studio, getting back with George Martin, and starting sessions full of unprecedented exploration that paid off, I think, very, very much big time for them, but also
very exciting.
Yeah, also had some consequences. We'll be back with you again in a couple of weeks, but in the meantime, thanks again for listening to BC the Beatles. And as always, subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you're listening right now. And give us a rating and review so other Beatlemaniacs can find us.
And follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter/X, and TikTok. We'll be posting photos, and we'll make sure to post some of those Whitaker photos from all of the shoots we talked about. And we'll be posting more from this episode and beyond. And remember, you can always drop us a line at bcthebeatles@gmail.com. And we will see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.